ladies and gentlemen. We all good? Thank you. Well, welcome, and I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Legislation Committee. The Senate has referred to the committee the particulars of proposed expenditure for 2016-17 and related documents for the Infrastructure and Regional Development Portfolio. The committee may also examine the annual reports of the departments and agencies appearing before it. The committee has before it a program listing agencies relating to matters for which senators have given notice, and the proceedings today will begin with an examination of the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. The committee has fixed Friday 7 July as the date for the return of answers to questions taken on notice. Senators are reminded that any written questions on notice should be provided to the committee secretariat by the close of business Friday 2 June 2017. Under Standing Order 26, the committee must take all evidence in public session. This includes answers to questions on notice. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to the committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The Senate, by resolution in 1999, endorsed the following test of relevance of questions at estimates hearings. Any questions going to the operations or financial positions of the departments and agencies which are seeking funds in the estimates are relevant questions for the purpose of estimates hearings. I remind officers that the Senate has resolved that there are no areas in connection with the expenditure of public funds where any person has a discretion to withhold details or explanations from the Parliament or its committees unless the Parliament has expressly provided otherwise. The Senate has resolved also that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given a reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to the Minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I particularly draw the attention of witnesses to an order of the Senate 13 May 2009 specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. Witnesses are specifically reminded that a statement that information or a document is confidential or consists of advice to government is not a statement that meets the requirements of the 2009 order. Instead, witnesses are required to provide some specific indication of the harm to the public interest that could result from the disclosure of the information or the document. An officer called to answer a question for the first time shall state their full name and the capacity in which they appear, and witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. Could I also please remind everyone present to switch off their mobile phones or render them inaudible. I now welcome the Honourable Senator Fiona Nash, Minister for Regional Development, Regional Communications and Local Government and Territories, and Mr Mike Murdoch, Secretary of the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development, and Mr Mick Kinley, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. Before we start, I just want to place on the record my thanks to Senator Back and to the Deputy for holding the fort here yesterday while I attended a funeral up in Queensland. I really appreciate that, and I think I understand things went very smoothly. Minister Nash, Mr Murdoch or Mr Kinley, do any of you wish to make an opening statement?
No, thank you, Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
No, Chair. Thank you.
No, thanks, Chair.
All right, thank you. Senator Stirl.
Or not?
Toast to absent friends.
Oh, sorry, sorry, Senator Cameron. My apologies.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Mr Kinley, as you're aware, on the March 29th, I submitted a number of questions to Minister Chester. They were due for response on April 28th. Why have I had no response from these? Has the department provided advice to the Minister on these issues?
It's Mick Kinley, Chief Executive Officer of AMSA. Good morning, Senator. And are you referring to the questions on the Maeve Anne?
Yep.
And
that's the only ones I've put.
And we've certainly put our answers through.
Okay. So when did the answers go to the Minister's office?
I'd have to check on that, Senator. it wasn't that long ago, but I've got a copy here, but I don't think they have a date on them. But I can certainly...
Except they were due back on April the 28th. Did you meet that timeline with the Minister's office?
Well, we certainly met the timeline that we were given.
Okay, so the responses were there by April the 28th. Where are they? Minister, do you know why I've got no responses?
Senator, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that information, but I'm happy to take it on notice for you.
Okay, okay. So, have you got a date when those responses went to the Minister's office?
Senator, if I might, Mike Murdoch, Secretary of the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development. We're just checking as to whether the Minister has cleared the answers to be provided. I will get an answer for you as quickly as possible, Senator.
Okay, thanks. Mr Kinley, what inspections were undertaken on the ME van by AMSA, its delegated agencies and any accredited private marine surveyor prior to the ME van sailing from Brisbane to Sydney on in 2016?
So the May van was an existing vessel under the national law, Senator. As a grandfathered vessel, she wasn't required to hold a certificate of survey, and my understanding is that prior to sailing to Sydney in 2016, she was monitored in 3rd of May 13, a ship monitoring inspection, and there was evidence of class inspections were completed on January 2014 and November 2014 and June 2016.
Okay, so you're aware, just so we get the context of this correct, this was a barge that sailed from Queensland to Sydney. There was a fatality aboard this barge where one of my constituents, Mr. Tim McPherson, was killed. Mr. McPherson has left a wife, a young baby at the time, and his wife was pregnant, so this family has been devastated by this fatality, and I'm really concerned that the ME van was not fit for purpose.
Senator, investigations are ongoing into this tragedy. The rightful organisation that has the lead in this is WorkSafe New South Wales. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority and indeed the national law does not deal with work health and safety, and work health safety is reserved under the intergovernment agreement on the national law for domestic commercial vessels that resides with the states.
You've got responsibilities in terms of the barge.
We have responsibilities in terms of the barge, and our delegate, Roads and Maritime New South Wales, are also investigating that side of the system. The barge, as you've asked, it had exemptions that were in place at the time, and those exemptions are things that the national standards for commercial vessels have in place that really aren't applicable to an unmanned barge. And from our investigations, none of those exemptions we can see are relevant to the circumstances of this particular tragic case.
Well, that's an assumption you're making.
Well, and I was just about to say that the investigations are ongoing in the matter.
Yeah. So there was no inspections taken before the ME van sailed to Sydney, is that correct?
Not immediately before.
Okay. Was there any steps undertaken by AMSA or its delegated agencies or any accredited private marine surveyor to ensure that the barge ME van was fit to sail from Brisbane to Sydney?
No, I think would be is from our current understanding, is no, there wasn't an investigation specifically for that function, or an inspection, I should say.
Was there any inspections undertaken by AMSA, its delegated agencies and any accredited private marine surveyor when the barge arrived from Brisbane and between the periods February 2016 to the 30th of May 2016?
No, she was not inspected in that period.
No inspections.
No.
Why were Brady Marine and Civil allowed to operate from February 2016 to the 30th of May 2016 with a barge that did not comply with AMSA safety regulations?
Neither AMSA or our delegates had issued permissions for operations in that period. It's the responsibility of the vessel operator to ensure that the relevant permissions are in place. There was a random compliance inspection on 30th of May where New South Wales Maritime became aware that the vessel was operating without a certificate of survey and immediately issued a prohibition notice.
So how could a ship sail from Brisbane to Sydney with no certificate of survey?
Senator, that's a matter for an operator who chooses to do something outside of what the law might require.
Pardon?
Well, Senator, we don't hold a gate, let's say, that we open and check every vessel that departs every port every time in Australia. Now, our investigations are ongoing into why that's happened, if there have been any breaches in that case.
Can I get it clear what you're saying? Basically, a shipping company can break the law if they choose to break the law, and if they're not caught, they're not caught? Is that what you're telling me?
Senator, if people choose to break the law, we will do our utmost to catch them. But I cannot guarantee as a regulator that we are watching every single operation every single day when every vessel goes in and out of port. That is not the way the regulator works.
So when was the last time the ME van was subject to any checks from AMSA?
The last time...
Prior to sailing from Brisbane?
Prior to sailing from Brisbane, I believe the Classification Society inspected it in November 2014.
And when you say the Classification Society, what's...
Again, a Classification Society is a third-party accreditation body. They are entrusted to class all the large trading ships that operate around the world.
So there was nothing for at least 3 years, no inspections on this barge?
Senator, there was, as I said, a monitoring inspection done in 2013, and from what I can see, Class have inspected it more or less annually.
Okay. So this is a barge who's come from Brisbane to one of the biggest construction sites in Australia, the Barangaroo site. Why did it take 4 months for AMSA to issue the barge operators with a prohibition notice?
Senator, there were no reports or anything to indicate that the vessel was operating illegally at that point in time. And as I said, it came to light when our delegate did an unannounced or random inspection.
So an unregistered barge, a barge that, in my view, was unfit for purpose,
Well,
we
don't have any indications that that's the case yet, Senator.
Well, from the photographs I've seen, what was happening on that barge wouldn't be allowed to happen on any industrial site anywhere, never mind a barge. But do you have a different view? Do you think it was okay?
Senator, from the maritime point of view, I know there have been inspections done. I know there was a prohibition notice issued. But again, as I said, the joint investigation is about the barge as a workplace and a work site, and there is also the barge as a floating maritime vessel as a matter as well.
So it took 4 months to issue the prohibition notice. What were the reasons for the prohibition notice? That was served on the 30th of May.
The primary one was operating without a certificate of survey.
That's right.
So what's the implications of not working, of working without a certificate of survey?
Again, Senator, there was, I think, confusion over the grandfathering of the vessel, whereas prior to the national system coming into place, vessels in Queensland that had been operating without a certificate of survey were grandfathered and allowed to continue. The certificate of survey is a document that's issued after an independent accredited surveyor attests to the seaworthiness of the vessel. It doesn't in no way relieve the operator of the vessel for ensuring that the vessel remains seaworthy and still continues to meet the standards. So the certificate of survey is a third-party accreditation of that.
So is there any sanctions or legal action been taken against the barge operators for operating without a certificate?
There are under the National Law Act.
Has that taken place?
Sorry, Senator?
Have you issued legal action
as I
against
said,
them?
those investigations are ongoing, and that is a matter of if we put a brief of evidence together, that goes to the DPP and whether prosecution takes place or not.
But this is a barge that's operated without a certificate, correct?
That's correct.
That's simply the facts.
And
So why haven't you taken action against the barge operator?
and that's why the barge was initially prohibited from operating, Senator. That was the first action that was taken when this came to light. And
No,
that
but
was
I'm asking, have you taken any subsequent action?
and I'll just check with
If
Mr.
not,
Schwartz.
why not?
Alan Swartz, General Manager Operations at AMSA. In answer to the question, Senator, no, there haven't been any action taken at this time. The investigation continues to be ongoing, and part of that is because the investigation is looking at the entire compliance with the national law regulations, and certificate of survey is one item of that.
It's one item. But if you don't have a certificate of survey, that barge should not have sailed, should it?
If a vessel is required to have a certificate of survey, because not all vessels are required to, but in the case of a vessel that is required to have a certificate of survey, then you're correct, Senator, that vessel should not operate.
So that vessel should not have sailed, and that worker should not have been killed.
On the basis of the information we have thus far, it would appear that the vessel is required to have a certificate of survey. It didn't, and that's part of the investigation that we're looking at, Senator.
Okay. So if you'd have done your job and stopped that vessel operating, then that young man could still be alive.
Obviously, I can't assert one way or the other to that, Senator.
Well, if the
because
vessel wasn't operating, that accident wouldn't have taken place, would it?
And it could equally be said that there would have been another barge operating, and it just depends on what the circumstances for this tragic incident were as to whether or not it would have been replicated in another way.
So what were the specific reasons for the prohibition notice that you slapped on this, that was put on the Me van when you finally inspected it?
The reason for the prohibition notice being issued on that day was because the vessel did not have a certificate of survey. And the prohibition notice was simply related to you don't have a certificate of survey, therefore you are prohibited from undertaking commercial operations.
So a vessel is required to remove the risk to the safety of persons or serious risk to the environment, as outlined in the prohibition notice. Is that correct?
They're the sorts of fundamental triggers for a prohibition notice, yes.
So was there a risk that was assessed to the safety of persons or a risk to the environment by the operation of the Me van?
At that point, I would say no. At that point, it was simply you don't have the required piece of paper demonstrating that the vessel meets the construction and equipment standards.
So when you say no, have you had a report to back up that assertion?
Again, Senator, this is the point of that investigation. When that investigation is complete, including...
This goes back some months now.
And
You must be aware whether this barge was a risk to the safety of persons
Senator, the certificate of survey is prima facie evidence that you take that the vessel complies with the required standards. In the absence of that certificate, the inspectors will make the judgment that, well, we don't know that it's not posing a serious risk because we don't have evidence of a third-party accreditation. Therefore, you put a prohibition notice on until that evidence is provided.
Okay. So basically the barge has sailed illegally from Brisbane to Sydney, correct?
As far as we can tell at this stage, yes.
Yeah, so it sailed illegally. It's operated illegally for a period of some 4 months, correct?
And again, Senator, operated has a specific meaning under the National Law Act, but the fact that it was operating without a certificate of survey and it was given a prohibition notice to stop that would indicate that we think that's the case.
Okay. What were the grounds that the New South Wales Maritime, operating as your delegate, a delegate of AMSA, issued a temporary operating exemption?
So in June 2016, the company applied for a temporary operating exemption. That was accompanied by a certificate of class from the Classification Society for the survey of the vessel, stability books for the vessel supplied by an accredited marine surveyor, and a declaration from an accredited surveyor about the safety equipment of the vessel, and a copy of the operator's safety management system. And on that basis, it was given a temporary operating permit.
So was this done on the papers, or was there an inspection done?
It was certainly inspected by the accredited surveyors.
Who were the accredited surveyors?
And I don't have the names with me, Senator, but people who are accredited under the national law to undertake that work.
So you can't even tell me who did that?
Well, I
mean,
could
surely,
go...
surely someone knows who this is.
Someone does know who it is,
Well,
Senator.
who?
I'm not saying...
It's your responsibility, isn't it?
I'm saying I don't have the actual name of the people with me right now. And yes, someone does know who the accredited marine surveyor does.
No, I don't have the name of the organisation or the company who were...
All right, can you provide the name, all that detail? I want to know what inspections were undertaken prior to issuing the temporary operating exemption, and who would then sign off from AMSA in relation to this?
Our delegate in New South Wales
Maritime
Authority, yeah. Yes.
Okay. So on what grounds did AMSA issue the specific exemption to the ME van on the 6th of October?
So those exemptions are requirements for, as I said earlier, for things that are not relevant to a non-propelled barge that are under the national standard, under the national law. So it includes things like masts for position of signals for a vessel's propulsion, fluid and steering systems, which of course are not relevant, certain safety equipment, communications and nav equipment, and tools that are not needed for barges that are not self-propelled. That exemption was also granted to certain conditions, namely that life jackets be worn at all times and a means of reboarding from the water be provided, navigation lights and shapes to be displayed when undertaking transit voyages, and the operator providing a standby vessel to carry safety equipment for the total number of persons on board the barge. Communications requirements were also a condition there. Owner of the vessel determining appropriate crew for the operations. Stability and structural calculations for each specific operation and loading being completed by an AMSA accredited surveyor, and manufacturer's instructions for safe working load and deck pressures not to be exceeded. So there were a range of conditions on that. And
so exemptions were provided for all of those that you've outlined?
Well, they were the conditions that I just mentioned on the exemptions being given for things like masts and things that a non-self-propelled barge does
Is
not
there a
need.
document somewhere that says here's the exemptions you've got?
Yes.
Have you got it here? Can
I
you
don't
table
have
that
it.
document?
I don't have it here, but we can certainly provide it to you.
You weren't expecting to be questioned on this issue, were you?
Oh, well, I was expecting to be questioned, but
Well, why can't you tell me these basic...
because I just read out what the conditions were, Senator.
All right, so I want a copy of the exemption document. Can you table that?
Yes, certainly, Senator.
Okay. So what inspections did AMSA as delegated agencies or any accredited private marine surveyor carry out in granting the exemptions? Now, we know there was an exemption, but I want to know what was done.
So the exemptions were considered in connection for the application of survey submitted to RMS. So the information included on the certificate of class from Lloyd's Register. So Lloyd's Register is the classification society inspect the vessel to ensure it maintains itself in class. The survey of the vessel and the stability books for the vessel were to be approved by other accredited surveyors accredited by AMSA. And I think there was an inspection done by the accredited surveyor as well.
Okay, so you can't tell me who the accredited surveyor was, you don't know.
Well, we do know, I just do not have that name with me.
Okay. So did they actually go on board and do inspections?
Yes, Senator, they would have done.
So when did they do that?
I would have to check on the actual exact date, Senator.
And then-
But prior to that being issued, of course.
So, prior to the issue of the exemption. All right, so is there any documentation in relation to the marine surveyor who carried out the inspections? Do you have documentation
In what regard, Senator?
in regard to providing the
the
exemption? What they did, what they inspected, when they went there, what they found?
Yes, Senator, there
Right.
would be documentation.
Okay, so that's documentation that is in your purveyance, and that's, you need to have a look at
It
that.
will either be in our hands or in our delegates' hands.
Okay, so are you confident it wasn't done on the papers that there was an actual inspection?
Yes, Senator.
But you can't tell me when and by whom?
Not the exact name of the person, no, Senator. But it is an accredited surveyor. I mean, there's a list of every surveyor we've accredited on our website, where there are a bunch of regulations which we implement before we accredit the surveyors. The surveyors, before they're accredited, are interviewed by a panel of people who question them on the procedures and an understanding of the rules and the standards. So it's not just a random bunch of people. There is a controlled list of accredited surveyors.
All right, can you provide me all documentation in relation to the inspections and the exemptions and the prohibitions that were issued by AMSA in relation to the ME van? All documentation.
Yes, Senator, we can do that.
What steps were taken to ensure that the ME van owner and operator complied with the conditions in the exemption certificate?
Again, Senator, it's the responsibility of the operator to comply with those conditions. We do inspect the vessels on a random basis as necessary. I don't believe the vessel has been inspected yet on those conditions. Likewise, we've had no indications of any activity that they're not complying with those conditions.
So we've got a vessel that sailed illegally from Brisbane to Sydney, operated illegally for 4 months. You then say you can only operate under these exemptions and these orders, and you do nothing
Senator,
to check it. Is that correct?
Senator, again,
Is that correct?
Senator, we've not had any intelligence to suggest they're not complying with those conditions. The vessel was operating...
What kind of intelligence would you get
The vessel...
other than you go and look at it?
I would suggest
We should
that,
let the witness answer
that the
your
people
question.
working on the barge would certainly alert us to any of those sorts of issues if it wasn't complying with those sorts of conditions.
The people working on the barge?
Again, we do get reports from crew or from operators or competitors, those sorts of people who will certainly tell us if there is an issue they think with the operation of the
But given
barges.
this
Unions give
vessel
us reports.
sailed illegally, given that it operated illegally, AMSA then depends on someone blowing the whistle.
And
Is that
we
correct?
also, and our delegates also inspect the vessels, Senator, but From your statement that the vessel operated illegally, and as I said, our investigations and our preparing a brief of evidence or whatever action we will take is still ongoing. From that operator's point of view and going under the old grandfathering arrangements for the national system, there was certainly, I think, confusion under that operator's view about how the new national law was working. So the original...
So it's a confused operator?
Well, again, Senator, because they were operating within Queensland under the grandfathering arrangements, they were actually legally allowed to operate in Queensland without a certificate of survey.
But not in Sydney?
Now it was shifting the jurisdiction that triggered the end of those grandfathering arrangements, and that was when it became illegal, as you say.
Okay. All right, so basically AMSA did nothing, or any of your delegates did nothing to see whether this barge was operating in compliance with the orders that were issued?
Senator, certainly at this stage we haven't inspected it, but that's not to say we aren't intending to inspect it.
Well, that's terrific. A young man's been killed, and you're intending to inspect.
And Senator, that investigation is ongoing, and we, as much as anybody, want to know what happened there, and we want to know if it was any failings of the national law standards that led to this tragedy, or if it is in fact a work health and safety arrangement issue.
But
Senator.
you've got the ultimate responsibility for the barge in terms of its seaworthiness, and you've got responsibilities. We've had a young man killed on this barge.
Senator.
So what investigations have you done between hearing this young man was killed? What have you done?
And Senator, as I said, our investigations are ongoing. WorkSafe New South Wales have the lead because of our understanding of this is actually a work site in New South Wales. It was a construction site.
But it's also a barge.
It's also a barge, and I'm
that's
not denying.
So I'm interested in what your don't care what anybody else's responsibilities are. I want to make sure you've complied with your obligations.
And my understanding now, Senator, is that the barge is complying. It has exemptions. It has exemptions from things that are, as I've said already, are about things that standards require that
well, how have you come to that
barge
conclusion if you've had no one on the barge?
Well, I don't have anyone on the barge right now, but the barge has been investigated. Our accredited surveyors have looked at it. The principal things that worry us about barges, whether it's stable, has been investigated. We've had independent reports on the stability of the vessel. The fact that the arrangements are on board for people if they fall in the water, they can get out of the water, life jackets, recovery of people, communications are the sorts of things that we've ensured that those arrangements and those conditions are in place.
Oh, it just seems like a sad story.
Really. It is a sad story.
And it's a sad story from your agency's position as well. How many domestic commercial vehicles were operating in Queensland in March 2017?
6,900 is the best available data we have at the moment, and that data is, got to say, as we move towards taking on these functions under the national system, we're discovering the data is interesting.
So how many staff were employed by AMSA and its delegated agencies in New South Wales and Queensland to undertake inspections of domestic commercial vessels in March 2017 to ensure compliance with the regulatory system?
So, Australian Maritime Safety Authority, we've got 21 appointed maritime safety inspectors with a total FTE of 362. Maritime Safety Queensland have got a total of 55 appointed MSIs, I believe, with a 262 FTE. New South Wales delegate has 101 appointed inspectors, MSIs, and I believe a total FTE of 237.
Okay. Can you provide, can you table a document that outlines all of the staff and what they do? Both Queensland, New South Wales and AMSA?
I can tell you which ones are appointed as maritime safety inspectors. Is that?
Well, if that's
Who are the people responsible?
Yes. So if you can
Okay.
provide details of
Yes.
that. Okay. How much revenue has been provided by the government to fund AMSA for its role as a safety regulator for domestic vessels?
Under a COAG arrangement, the states and the Northern Territory provide around $4 million funding for AMSA under the current arrangements.
Okay.
Under the current arrangements, though, AMSA is not the service delivery agent. So the states and territories, the service delivery agents, they employ the maritime safety inspectors, surveyors and exercise those delegations under the national law on our behalf.
But those delegations are changing, aren't they? You're going to have full responsibility.
There is currently a proposal that they change on 1 July 18.
Yeah. So what arrangements have been put in place to make sure you're funded to undertake your safety role?
Those arrangements are still under discussion with states and territories at the moment.
So when was this legislation passed?
The National Law Act has been in place since in effect since 1 July 13. The change in service delivery arrangements will they will require some machinery amendments to that Act, which haven't actually been put in place yet. But Transport Ministers at the Transport and Infrastructure Council agreed in November 2014 to move down this path.
So is it correct that some of the operators were concerned about levies on the operators to fund the safety functions?
No, that is correct, Senator.
So the industry is saying we don't want to fund the safety function, and on that basis we've still got this, we can't comply with Australian law.
Senator...
We can't implement the will of the Parliament, can we?
Well, the will of the Parliament is implemented now. It's with the states and territories implementing the national law, so we already have a national system. It's a very diverse industry, and it has been subject to very varying levels of cost recovery. And for example, in one state, cost recovery has been down around 9%, whereas other states have been at near full cost recovery. So if you go along to that industry, a lot of which is the fishing industry, small regional operators, single sole traders, those sorts of things, and you tell them they're going to go from a 9% cost recovery up to 100%, they're not very happy about that. But this is, as I said, it's a very broad industry. We have jurisdiction over people who hire out kayaks, to tourists, right up to construction barges, larger operators such as tug operators, big tourism operators. So there is
You've got 21 people doing that.
we have 21 from the purposes of
Right.
we are the holder of the standards and the regulations at the moment. So
is there any view that the states have been reducing their resources in this area?
I think the states were certainly looking at winding down their resources on the basis of handing over to us.
Okay, so they're winding down. Do you have details about how many jobs have gone in that safety area?
I don't have those details, Senator, but
Who's got it?
But it is also changing the model of how they regulate. And for example, moving to an accredited third-party surveyor system, whereas a lot of the governments were doing the surveys themselves, in advance of us taking on service delivery, and that model has been working in other jurisdictions. It's been working in New Zealand for some time. As we're growing the market of the accredited surveyors for the operators to use, some of the states are getting out of that survey business and handing that over to the private sector.
Is there any shortfalls in funding to ensure a proper approach by AMSA?
We don't have a resolution, I think, is what I can say at this stage for the how to transition the industry from, as I said, varying levels of cost recovery. But we're very much hoping that will be resolved soon.
Is that the best you can give me?
At the moment, Senator, that's the
Okay,
best
so
I can give you.
what meetings are in place to ensure funding?
Senator, if I can assist, Transport Ministers met at the Ministerial Council last Friday in Brisbane, and this was one of the key agenda items. As Mr Kinley's indicated, AMSA last year consulted the industry on cost recovery arrangements through both levy and fees. There was a very strong pushback from the industry about increasing charges, particularly in jurisdictions that to date had very low levels of cost recovery. We've been working across the jurisdictions to see if we can get funding support by government to ease the transition costs for industry. Ministers discussed this in November and again on Friday. We got very close to resolution, but have yet not got resolution. There remain, at the moment, a small number of jurisdictions who have not agreed to continue transition funding over a 5 to 10 year period to support the industry.
What jurisdictions are those?
We predominantly at this stage, as a result of Friday, it's Queensland has yet to agree to the funding of the transition arrangements. New South Wales has agreed to the proposal the Commonwealth placed on the table on Friday, as has Victoria with some variation to the model. We are yet to get final agreement from Queensland and South Australia.
So here we, people are dying on AMSA regulated barges, and we've got no agreement on the oversight and safety
We
issues.
have,
Is that correct?
no, Senator. We have agreement for AMSA to take on the service delivery role from 1 July 18. What we don't have agreement on yet is how the cost to industry can be mitigated so that particularly small operators do not face large price shocks as AMSA takes on this role, and whether governments are prepared to provide transitional funding support to essentially ease the burden on small operators in particular. But the regulatory regime, as Mr Kinley's indicated, has been agreed for some time. The start date was pushed back last year by 1 year to enable the funding issues to be sorted out. We are hopeful that that can be done in the coming weeks.
And Senator, I guess more importantly for us is that we recognise that the interface between what we do on the vessels and what the work health and safety authorities do is a very important part of this system. So we've already written to the heads of workplace safety agencies to actually seek agreement that we can renegotiate our MOUs with each of the work safety bodies in each jurisdiction, because, as I said, work health and safety remains the jurisdiction of the states. We look after the things that float, and it is very important that we have those interface issues sorted out and that we can work together in cases such as this to identify whether it's a flaw in our system or a flaw in their system, or how we can both work to stop this sort of thing happening.
So if a barge has a crane on board the barge, is that your responsibility?
No, I would say, apart from how it impacts on the stability of the vessel and the general safety obligations. But there is no specific standards under the national law for cranes.
So that's right, Senator. So in regards to whether the barge can take the weight of that crane, if it's a portable crane or a mobile crane, that is an element we would be interested in, how that crane is secured to the barge. But when it comes to the determination of the safe working load of that crane, if it's been put on board, if it's a mobile crane, then that would be state work health safety.
So you're looking at these issues in relation to the ME van, given it's got a crane on board?
That's certainly one of the issues. It's important to where this investigation takes us.
So tell me about your investigation. What steps have you taken to commence the investigation?
And again, Senator, as I've said, safe work. They're taking the lead in this because.
No, I'm asking. I'm interested in what AMSA have done.
Well, from our point of view, it's about the seaworthiness and the compliance of the barge with the national law. And as I said, those conditions but I'm not sure that Mr. Schwartz has got more to add on that.
And it is a case that this is if you like, a joint investigation. The New South Wales Work Health and Safety people are on the lead with it, but we are also working with them and with New South Wales Police, who are working on behalf of the coroner, and our delegate RMS are involved in I guess, that joint investigation. So
what level of officers are engaged with the police and WorkSafe?
This would
New
be
South Wales?
our marine safety inspectors, and also AMPS's own compliance area are also involved with our delegates as well.
Okay. What lessons have you learnt from what's happened with the Me van?
At this point, we're still waiting on that investigation report to come in so that we can actually have a proper informed view of what are all of the lessons that can be learned.
So basically, barges could be moving from one state to another and not be compliant. Is that correct? You wouldn't know?
As Mr. Kinley said earlier, Senator, we're not on the wharf as each barge comes and goes. So can I put my hand on my heart and say 100% certainty? No, I can't. What I can say, though, is the way AMPSA and our delegates work is essentially on a risk-based approach to inspections.
Well, the risk was pretty big on this one because we've had a fatality. So the risk basis hasn't been looked at properly, has it?
And again, Senator, without knowing whether the fatality is relevant to the things that the national law covers, or whether it was a construction-related tragedy, is something we don't know yet.
But you've had a barge move from Queensland to Sydney, non-compliant, illegally. Surely you would want to stop that happening ever again.
We certainly don't want to see it happen again, and I know our manager in Sydney certainly gets, I think, quite good advice on what's happening on the Sydney Harbour now with construction barges there. He is in fairly regular communication with the unions about any issues that they want to raise about the barges that are working in Sydney.
So has that been since the fatality, or has that been a long-standing position?
No, I think that has been ongoing. That we've got those relationships there. There is also long-standing arrangements which we are going to have to deal with under the national law about the grandfathering arrangements as well. And that's, as I said, these are things which were existing rights that people had under the national law. As such as the barges that were allowed to operate in Queensland.
But not allowed to operate in Sydney?
Well, as I said, it was legal before in Queensland that vessels didn't need a certificate of survey. They could choose to declare the vessel was seaworthy. That is certainly an issue.
So self-regulation, basically, is it?
There was an element of that, and under the national law, there is a mandatory survey regime for vessels of that size now.
Why couldn't you issue a notice to all barges that are operating in Australia that if they are going to move from one jurisdiction to another, they have to notify you guys?
Well, that I think that was advised at one point, and that's clearly we need to go out and do that trawl again and let people know.
So the operator of the Me van had been advised if they leave Queensland, they had to notify AMSA.
Well, the industry had been advised about the grandfathering arrangements remained while you didn't change jurisdictions.
Can you provide details of that notification?
Yes, Senator.
Now, have you been discussing with the government the possibility of supplementing the industry levy while these negotiations are being undertaken?
What do you mean by supplementing, Senator? I'm sorry, I'm not clear.
Making sure you've got enough people to carry out the work, both at state and federal level.
We've certainly been discussing with all the jurisdictions the resources and the resourcing required for the national system.
As I said earlier, Senator, on Friday, the Commonwealth put a paper to jurisdictions setting out a proposed contribution schedule over 10 years by each of the jurisdictions, including the Commonwealth.
Can I have a copy of that?
Certainly, Senator.
What were the outcomes of the meeting?
As I said, I think there was general agreement to the principle of providing funding support by jurisdictions over a 10-year period to ease the impact on the industry of AMSA taking on the national regulatory role. But there was not agreement to the payment of certain amounts by Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia. I think agreed in principle, but has yet to agree the funding involved.
So in the meantime, we still have this hybrid approach where it's a combination of state and national regulation.
We have the national law being applied by jurisdictions as effectively agents of AMSA.
Yeah.
It was agreed 2 years ago for AMSA to take over the whole national system, to remove the inconsistencies of the system. But of course that has been subject to try and settle funding arrangements, and I said that was deferred by a year because of the concerns of the industry about the cost impost, particularly in those jurisdictions where there had been relatively low levels of cost recovery.
Was this a pretty profitable industry?
Not for the smaller end of the industry.
Very
Senator.
wide variation right across it. As I said, Senator, it comes from sole operator fishing operations, people hiring out kayaks, up to major ferry operators, Sydney ferries.
If somebody's
and what have you.
hiring a kayak out, they wouldn't be expecting AMSA to come down and do an inspection, because you can have a barge operating on the biggest construction site in New South Wales and you won't see an AMSA inspector.
Well, they
For
certainly
4 months anyway.
Well, they certainly did see one of our delegates, which is who identified that the vessel was not certified.
Okay, so I've got questions on notice. Why?
Senator, just in relation to that, I've made inquiries. My understanding is that advice has been provided, and I will undertake to seek the Minister's agreement to finalise that response to you as quickly as possible.
Well, can I just indicate my concern that these questions were in? It's over a month overdue. Not one question answered. Not one question. And I think that's treating this committee with contempt and senators with contempt. We are entitled to have legitimate questions answered, especially when it relates to a death.
Certainly, Senator, and I will undertake to find out why the answer has been delayed. And as I said, I will seek the Minister's agreement to expedite the answer.
Okay. Well, I'll have a look at the Hansard of this, and there may be further questions arising
Certainly,
from the
Senator.
Hansard. Chair, thanks very much for your indulgence on
Can I
this.
say, Mr Murdoch, I join Senator Cameron's comments about these answers to questions on notice, particularly on these important matters. And I think I can speak on behalf of the whole committee when you go to the Minister to ask him or her to prioritise the return of these as soon as possible.
Certainly, Chair. I think we have provided answers to questions taken on notice in this committee on time, but these were questions asked in the Senate, and Senator Cameron's quite right to ask that those timeframes be met. I will undertake to find out why that hasn't taken place.
All right, thank you, Mr Murdoch. Thank you, Senator Cameron. You have single-handedly rooted up our entire agenda for the day.
No, he's been a part of this.
Well, I think so.
I feel like
isn't
we're
it?
channeling Bill.